Hi everybody, and thanks Kelly for the intro, and we're talking all about Build Back Better because part of my job is to expand on what you said and build on it, and hopefully I'll answer some questions too. So my name's Ian Gibbs. I'm a building surveyor, been in the insurance industry for about 25 years, and I work for a company, it's not relevant today, called Sedgwick, but you might have heard of them if you had a flood claim, and if it went badly, nothing to do with me. But we manage claims on behalf of the insurance company. So if you have a claim, sometimes they'll say, send a loss adjuster out, and we'll deal with your insurance claim on their behalf. Has everybody, most people here had an insurance claim for flooding? Or not many, or yeah, there's people that have. So those that have will experience a loss adjuster coming round. So that's the company I work for. I'm not a loss adjuster, I'm a surveyor working in that environment. So basically, for the practical purposes, I would be one of the people that came out to your house after the loss adjuster had talked to you about the cover and what's included and what to do and where to live and all those sort of things. And I would talk to you about how to repair your building. What needs to be repaired, what needs to be taken out, and at the same time, there's an opportunity to talk about flood resilience, which is what I'm trying to weave into what I'm talking about now. So I'm going to talk about flood resilience has been mentioned, so I'll skip over the bits that have been mentioned and I think we've covered and talk a bit more about other bits. So what is flood resilience? What's the process if you have a claim that we would now use to engage with Build Back Better and bring flood resilience into the mix? A little example of a case, you can see what we're talking about in practice, and I'll mention some of the challenges. So what is flood resilience? Has anybody into the BRE, Flood Resilient House at Watford? Probably not. So at Watford, yeah, you have, oh, well done, Kelly. The BRE, Building Research Establishment, has its base in Watford. And if you're a techie building person, you've probably been there. Here is a Victorian terraced house. On the ground floor, they turned into a flood resilient home. So these are tiles, obviously looking like floorboards. So that is an example of flood resilient kitchen. So these are some of the things that I don't think look like that's a flood house. I don't know whether people disagree, but it's just a house, right? It's not a big house, but it's just an example of how you would, but house and home, if you went to one of those things, they have a part of a building cut away. It's sort of looking a bit like that. On the right-hand side, we've got a flood door, we've seen that before. We've got non-return valves on the small waste pipes, barriers you could put across your doors, barriers that you put across your outside boundary wall, I guess, and a sump and pump. So we're talking about here at property level, what can you do to protect your home, really, to have a lesser impact from a flood? So there's language earlier, and I'm part of the group that was involved with the Code of Practice, which is the sort of the standard how-to guide for flood resilience. And we had long discussions, which are terribly boring but important, about words. So what do you think about by being resilient? I call it bounce back ability, whatever you want to call it. I can recover from this. So we thought, well, that's really what we're trying to say. If you have a flood, how can I get back on my feet quicker? So we thought we ought to change the words a bit and talk about resistance, trying to keep the water out or minimize the water entry, or recoverability, if my feet get wet or my floor gets wet, how can I recover quicker? So you might try and keep the water out. You might mean that if the water gets in, it doesn't really cause any damage, which is what you're talking about, Kelly, perfectly. But we've used the words resistance and recoverability because I think it better describes the approaches that you can take. But it's all being resilient. So that's the language we've been trying to use. So when you see training, code of practice, they'll be talking in this sort of language, something we're trying to sort of introduce. So we've seen some of these. See the resistance measures. So this is a non-return valve, so the waste can go out from your property into the sewer, but can't come back the other way. And air brick we've seen. These manual devices where you actually put a barrier over the air brick or in front of the door, obviously human intervention. Go and get yourself a door that shuts like any other door, you lock it, it's a flood door, you don't have to do anything. So you have to think about what you're trying to achieve and how much effort you want to do to protect your property. That's just an example of a schematic of the flood house. But what we're talking about for the flood house is how you can have a resilient kitchen, a sump and pump in the house so any water that gets in gets removed, tile floor which looks like wood, walls and wall finishes that aren't affected by the water. Or they are affected in the sense that they get a bit wet, but you don't need to take the plaster off the wall if it does get wet. Because what the real problem is, if you have a flood claim, anyone's had a flood claim, did they take the plaster off the walls if you had plastered walls? Yeah. Now the sad news is that was most of the times entirely unnecessary. But as an industry, we've got used to taking the plaster off. So the examples are knowing what's resilient in your property is really important, because in the future there'll be things that we would previously have taken out because we think they're damaged that we can keep in. So that's understanding how resilient a building is. So that's really important part of what we do in this world. So what's the process? The documents I'm showing you here is the methodology. If I said, how do you do, I don't know, flood risk, and I said to my mum, I'd say, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm flood resilience. She'd go, I don't understand anything about it, Ian. I said, well, have a look at that, I'd say. There's a 3-page guide. This is what flood resilience is all about. And she'd have a quick read and ask me any questions. Then, if someone is a bit more techy and they say, well, what's this really look like? I want to ask some more questions. Then the code of practice guidance gives you lots of real examples of what flood resilience is, and all the way through the flood risk bit, to the survey, to the repairs, all that stuff, right? So that's where you look for more detail, mostly for professionals, but that's there. And here is the actual code of practice, which is more the pared down, these is how you do it, the how-to guide without an explanation. So you've got the basic rules, how you do it with lots of examples and helping practitioners do it, and finally, how you understand it if you're the punter in the street, really. So these documents are really, really important, and if ever you get anything done, say, if they don't know about the code of practice, show them the door, because they don't understand flood resilience. So it's in stages. Great what we've got here from ACOM. They talk about really the process you've got to go through on their process. So you have to do the flood risk bit, which is great. We've heard a lot about that today. You have to understand the flood risk. You have to do the property survey. Someone like me comes out, meets you on the claim. We walk around and understand how your building's built, what it's made of, etc. Then we look at the options. How could it work, and how could it work for you as a homeowner? And I'm not going to talk so much about this, but construction, commissioning, maintenance, I'll talk about in a bit. So this has been covered, but without using the words. The methodology you use is source, pathway, receptor. Sounds as a flash, but it's really obvious, but it's a good discipline. So what are the sources of flooding? So we've mentioned these. There was a quiz earlier, and we did rather well. I thought 5 out of 6, I think we got, saying surface water, rivers, groundwater, and all this. You know this stuff. So, but you have to understand, what is that risk? What's the likelihood? What's the possible depth? So lots of times, the EA guidance is really good. It talks about low, medium, and high. But you can get specialist flood risk reports, which will tell you the predicted depths. So 100 millimetres for a 1% annual chance, 200 millimetres for 5% annual chance, whatever it is, a 0.1% annual chance rather. So if you've got a small chance of flood happening, it will be deeper. If you've got a bigger chance, it will be shallower. But they're giving you those depths, because the reason those depths are important is that you need to understand what you're protecting against. So you can't do this stuff about deciding what you're going to do unless you really understand the risk. And that's a pit that's sometimes missed out of flood resilience. Then there's a pathway. What's the route it's going to get to the building? And then is the building or asset that you're trying to protect. So you're thinking, is it coming over the back of the fields? Is it coming off the ditches? Is it coming through the front door down the road? So as a surveyor, you're trying to understand those things. So what's the building survey all about? Well, I come and see you, or me, a surveyor like me. I'm trying to understand what your risk is, and therefore I'm looking at your building, and I'm looking at how it's built. I'm looking at how much of a survey needs to do. Is this about the whole site or just one building? How much do I need to investigate the structure of the building? Is it visual, or do I have to open things up and have a look? Really important, what matters to the person living there? This is often missed. Talk about technical stuff. My mum's 84, pretty active. But if I said, if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and it's raining, can you just go to the back of the garden about 30 foot away, get the barrier out, pop down, put it in? Then she'd probably say, I could, because I'm pretty good, son, but I'd rather not. So I said, do you want to spend another 2,000 and have a flood door so you can go to sleep at night and not worry about it? She'd say yes. So if I'm a surveyor and I just say, oh, best option, madam, is to get a flood barrier, they're £500 cheaper. It's a useless survey, because it's not really understanding what the people need. So this is all about the people. Your home, how you protect it, and you need to have that depth of understanding of how resilient the building is, what the flood risk is, what the customer wants, what they're able to afford, what they're able to put in manually, whether they go on holiday a lot. What about if you go on holiday? You don't want a barrier, do you? You want a flood door. So you have to think about the individuals. And ultimately, how do you dry and decontaminate the building if water does get in? If you've got to take off the resilient measures to get to a gap behind, they're not a resilient measure, are they? Because by definition, they have to come off. So you have to think about how you would dry and decontaminate the building for any water that gets in. So ask for a surveyor with a track record. Hopefully you won't get flooded again, but when you're revising people, get a surveyor with a track record doing these things. There is training that started from CIWEM, Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management, which is like the qualification body, I guess, and like the RSCS for surveyors, for water people, it's CIWEM. So I helped them write the training on this, and it's to try and get general introduction, but also surveyors, flood risk experts, contractors to get trained up to do things in the right way. So follow the code is what I say. Not the green cost code, but if anyone's old enough to remember that, but the flood resilient code. So options development. This is a process by which I go along to a building, a surveyor would. They look at all these risks, they come up with some ideas, and they write this in a report and say to you, these are the ideas, there might be two options that are obvious for you. Then there's a discussion afterwards to say, well, what do you think of the ideas? This isn't like, I'm the surveyor, I'm clever, I'm going to go along and tell you the right thing for your building. It's what's right for you and what's right for the building and what's right for the flood risk, right? So you need to be sitting around a dining room table with lots of tea and biscuits and saying, so do you like that? Why? Is it cost you're worried about, or is it the fact that you've got to get involved in doing things? So that's a really, really important part of the process. And at the end of that, you talk about how you're going to maintain it and how you're going to look after it and all those sorts of things. It's obviously really important too. But the design responsibility is often not with one person, because somebody will be giving you the advice, say, oh, I think this is what you should do. Then Jones, the builder's come along and doing it. So if it goes wrong, is it the person recommending it, or is it the person doing it? That can be confusing. So all you need to do is ask a simple question. If it goes wrong, who will be responsible? So you understand who you're really in contract with and who's taking responsibility for the advice they're giving you or the work they're doing. An issue that was talked about a bit, but I think is really important, is I can come up with lots of proposals, but what is your appetite for risk? If I was commercial-wise, if I was a factory producing food, just an inch of water through is not really going to cut it, is it? Because Tesco's aren't going to take your food if you had an inch of water through, and you might lose the contract. And it's like, I've got to keep this water out. And I know big Tesco's and places like that have spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds protecting buildings because the cost of taking that building out is millions and millions of pounds. So they'll spend it. Whereas somebody that's retired, lives at home, and is at home a lot, if you said, oh, it's a really good option, £1 million to protect your house, of course they're not going to do it. But if you said, well, there's two options here, 10,000 or 8,000, depending whether you want to get involved and do things, then that's a different conversation, isn't it? So it's really important that those conversations relate to what risk you're willing to accept, what actions you're willing to take, what are you trying to do here? That's the really crucial part. The construction bit is fairly obvious. You need the right products installed to the right standards, you need to be told how to use them, and you need to know how to maintain them. Part of the code of practice says, when you've had them put in, make sure your original surveyor or somebody else comes back and checks they're done right. Because you don't know it's done right. What's the detailed explanation? So get the surveyor around again as part of the code of practice process and make sure it's put in right and signed off. Just a quick look at resilience in practice. So loss adjusters, when they go along, they have to check that the qualifying conditions are met. And as Kelly was saying, it varies by insurer. They'll say, oh, the claim's got to be above £10,000 or the money's not available. So a small claim won't get billed back better. It may, if it's Thames water main going in the street and flooding your basement, that won't be billed back better either. So when we say flood, everyone thinks a flood is when water comes through the door, isn't it? That's a flood, right? Well, not according to the definition of flood risk. So we have to be really careful that we don't just think it's always £10,000 and if ever you've been flooded. It's up to 10,000, depending on whether the insurer signs up to 2, 5, 7 or 10,000, whatever they sign up to. So they sign up to a number and the insurers have different numbers. So that's an important thing to consider. And if you're signed up to the 8,000, it's got the qualifying conditions. So the loss adjuster does all that, then has to have a conversation with the customer about what it's all about and do they want to do it? And is it a good thing to do? But that's really about winning the customer over. You need to win the customer over and explain to them, this is something that's really good for you. It's going to make you sleep at night. This is worth doing, rather than just be discarded as, oh, I don't really want to think about that, thanks. I'd rather not think about flood. It's happened once, 1 in 100, I'm sorted. I've had it, I'm 55, I'm not going to live to 150, so I'm not going to get flooded. I know you know that's not true, but you'd be amazed at how many people do tell us that. So unless we have that conversation to explain risk remains, then they won't want to sign up to the money. Surveyor like myself will get involved, experienced in this, do the report, talk about it, get the works done, and sign off the completed works. So I've talked a lot about the policyholder, because what we've learned is that loss adjusters are very busy people. There's lots going on in a claim to do with alternative accommodation contents, restoration of the contents, buildings claim. It's really a really frantic, hectic job, which is why I'm a surveyor, not a loss adjuster. It's easy for them to go, yeah, I've just mentioned flood resilience, customer wasn't interested. So what we're doing, and is really important, is that we get across to taking the time with the customer to actually discuss flood resilience and really understand what's from their perspective. Has anybody heard in talking to people about flooding, when people have been flooded once and are pretty confident that they're done and it's not going to happen again? You must have people in your villages that are like that think, well, I've been unlucky. Really bad, but it's not going to happen again, is it? We have people that have been flooded twice and they're still not convinced about putting measures in place. And we've waived £5,000 of government grant of people. And you know that postcode lottery when they come around and say, you've won £10,000, right? We were going around, not quite literally like that, but saying, we've got £5,000 to spend. It might have been better if we had it in a wad of cash. We want to help protect you against flooding. And they went, no thanks, it's nice of you to offer, but what? £5,000. It's like, we can do something. Even if it doesn't work, what have you got to lose? Well, I'm not sure it's really necessary, and I'm not sure it's going to happen again. And we go, no, when's the last time someone came to your door with £5,000 and you turned it down? We did some work with DEFRA. It's like, why does nobody want our money? And the answer was, I'm in denial. It's just not going to happen again. So this is going to happen with the 5 or 10 grand from Flood Re if we're not really, really careful with Build Back Better. It's going to happen for sure. So I've said to loss adjusters, you need to understand it from the customer's perspective. It's not your job to tell them stuff. It's your job to get them to understand, which is a completely different concept altogether. So you have to look at it from their point of view. So they've got to do a lot of that in the start. They've got lots of things to do there. They're talking about liability, about scope of alternative accommodation, contents. They're talking about then the building works, the flood resilience that the surveyor's talking about, customer contributions. It's basically a really hassle job. But they've got to input into this hassle job flood resilience. So you need to be asking questions if you're ever in this position to sort of draw out of them what you need, as well as expecting them to talk to you about it. So I've just quickly run through this. We've got a typical flood risk report talking about the return periods, the 1% chance of a flood of. There's a good example here. There's a 1% chance of an annual flood. When you look at it, there's no flooding. They say this is fine. But they have been flooded, so there's somewhere between a 1% chance and a 0.1% annual chance of 1.4 metres. Wow, so it's nothing to 1.4. That's a bit scary, isn't it? If I believe this one, if I just worry about the 100 millimetre flood I've had, I can say, oh yeah, I'll just put a little barrier in here because it's 100 mil, I'm done. Apart from the fact that there's 1.4 is the theoretical risk. So what you're protecting against, 100 or 1.4? This is what it's all about, folks. Yeah, and people don't give the right advice. They just talk about, I can help you, I can see you've been flooded, I'll deal with that flood. That's not the questions you need to ask. What is my risk? What am I willing to protect against? And how can it be done? So this is typical of a solid masonry construction, so solid walls, rendered on the outside, flooded twice, so the customer's now getting the message that it's going to happen again. We understand that the flood water has overtopped the banks, gone down the road, approached the house from the side and the front, flooded in the front door, come up through the suspended timber floors. So we're understanding then what the flood risk is from the previous page, and we understand whether this property is suitable for resistance or recoverability. So this is the sort of process we're going through. Talking to the customer, what we really work out is a pretty resilient building. It could resist water if you just dealt with the openings of the air bricks and the front doors. So this is fairly straightforward. We also got involved late on, so we couldn't do stuff in the house because it had already been finished. So the recoverability was difficult. We look at the weaknesses, we make recommendations, we look at the costs, and we discuss it through. So that's a sort of process you should be seeing in this. Lastly, challenges. I mentioned a bit about this. I was involved with the Environment Agency and we're looking at the behavioural science stuff. You know, the government's bin it, catch it, bin it, sneeze it stuff. Well, we got those people to help us look at flood resilience and understand how we communicate with people to get the message across and understand things from their perspective. Really interesting stuff. And what was really clear is people had to obviously accept their risk. Not as easy as it sounds, because most people are in denial. And if they accepted their risk, believe that they could do something about it and believe how they could do something about it. It's my responsibility. Now, your flood group was brilliant earlier, talking about how the team understand this risk isn't going away, we're going to work with it. But most people will rather deny it. So you have to go through these awareness of risk, I can do something about it, I'm in control, how do I do it, help me through it. Sounds easy, but if it was easy, then we'd have been giving the £5,000 away. It's clearly not easy, and that's why no one takes the money. So nothing's changed between a government grant and Build Back Better. All that's changed is the money is coming from a different place. If we're not, we have to change our ways of working if we're going to deliver something different. So best practice, I've mentioned this really, it's about taking the time, understanding it from the customer's perspective, reinforcing, checking in with people. Communication is about understanding that the message is taken on board, isn't it? Not just telling people stuff. If we're not careful, we're going to tell people stuff. We're not going to check in with them that they got it. And that's what really matters. And in the end, get them to engage and accept that that's the way to go. There are challenges ahead. So I'm working with the adjusting industry and insurers and everything, trying to get them more aware, doing training and that sort of thing. We've created the training, but there's not enough surveyors out there that's trained. The industry for making products is small, so if we get a big flood, we've got trouble, because you won't be able to build the things fast enough. And then when you get your Bob the contractor or Jane the contractor coming along to build it, they're I've never heard of this flood resilience, mate. It's like, well, no, we want to do it as part of the work. No, I've never heard, I don't believe in any of that stuff. So you're going to get a bit of that from the contractor. Try and get a door and you can't find one for 3 months if we get a big flood event, because a lot of demand on the small industry. There's great stuff out there, leaflets out there. Mary Dono was mentioned. YouTube Mary Dono. Has anyone seen any of her videos? They're absolutely super. Yeah, because they explain people like me do stuff like this and it works. It's really empowering because you can realise that could be you and you could do something about it. Ed Bardsley, Hazard and Hope is another really great set of videos, 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes. His are a bit longer, explaining about flood resilience and how it works. And there's the EMAG, which again Mary Dono has done, which is examples in EMAG form of flood resilience. On that note, I'll stop.